Well, welcome back everyone to our Give Matt a Break series. I was kind of guessing, I was thinking that he was coming back, him and the family, this weekend, and I was anticipating you guys coming back, and I knew Jim had missed a couple weeks from before, where we went over some pretty deep stuff. And so with that, before we get back into the final two chapters of Daniel here, is that I want to do a little bit of review for the benefit of those who have kind of missed out in the last couple weeks, kind of summarize it all. And with that, is that it's pretty dense material. And so three weeks ago, we rabbit trailed off from Daniel 10 after we identified the three characters that were with Daniel at the Tigris River. Daniel 12:5-6 showed us that there was an angel on each side of the bank with the glorious man, who we know as Jesus, on top of the water, walking on water, if you will. Having this scene diagrammed out helped us to mentally kind of follow the story, because it's kind of difficult to know like who's talking and who's being referred to in chapter 10. But we also saw that there was a lot of spiritual fighting going on in that realm. And then Gabriel is the one that was talking with Daniel and is the one who will give Daniel the final prophecy in 11-12. The realization that Gabriel was fighting with an evil spiritual being in chapter 10, and this one is being called the Prince over Persia, is that it forced us into a deeper dive into who these evil spiritual beings were that are called princes and stationed over the nations. That question ultimately took us back to the Tower of Babel, and there we discovered that in Deuteronomy 4:32, that God said that he stationed the sons of God over the 70 nations after he disinherited the nations at Babel, and then later he chose Abraham as his new nation whom he would work through, and ultimately the redemption plan flows down to Christ. A key factor in this determination was the translation issue over Deuteronomy 32:8. Here you can see that many versions will say the sons of Israel. It kind of leans towards that human side of it. And then you have the sons of God view, which is referring to spiritual beings on the other side. The evidence, though, landed in favor of the sons of God as the original wording instead of the sons of Israel. Now, after I got done posting that video, I'm always getting a few people to ask kind of follow-up questions or rebuttals. Some will look at the first couple points and say, well, maybe God's foreknowledge and sovereignty over history, he could just know that it was going to be 70, like Jacob's caravan. And you can't quite prove manuscript-wise, which one came first. But the ultimate issue with that is that in number 3, the textual issue, is that one's really hard to overcome, because if you stick with the sons of Israel view, is that it causes a contradiction with Deuteronomy 4:19. There is no evidence, manuscript evidence or anything like that leans 4:19 to anywhere else other than that is referring to the spiritual beings. So if you stick with this, we got a contradiction within Moses' own writing. But with the sons of God view in 32:8, is that it keeps it consistent between chapter 4 and 32. Now, I can imagine that this concept and this biblical worldview was kind of mind-blowing to a lot. I had a lot of questions after the first service asking kind of follow-ups. But at the same time, I think there was probably some, whether in here or watching online, were like, yeah, I'm just not buying that. And maybe think that I'm just kind of hitching myself to Michael Heiser in his book, and that this is kind of just a new thing that he invented. But the thing to that is that this is not really a new idea in, say, the 21st century. This actually can be traced even back to Jerome. He wrote a commentary on Daniel that ultimately was like the response to the first critic, if you will, to Daniel because of all the prophecies that are in there. And in his commentary in Daniel 7, verses 2-3, is that when he talks about the four winds of heaven in Daniel 7, that strive up the four beasts, that he says the following: The four winds of heaven, I suppose, to have been angelic powers to whom the principalities, governments, have been committed, in accordance with what we read in Deuteronomy. And then Jerome quotes Deuteronomy 32:8 with the angelic wording from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He clearly is following the sons of God view, and at this point, when somebody kind of sees like, okay, wow, this really does go all the way back, and there's further church writers, early church writers that talk about this as well. It's kind of like, well, what happened from 400 AD all the way to the present day? Because I'm sure if we took a straw poll within churches, is like, have you ever heard of this? I'm going to go well over 90% of us say, no, I've never have. Well, it's simple. Augustine in his writings, he objected to the sons of God view. When you get into Genesis 6 with the Nephilim and the sons of God with the cohabitation with the daughters of men, is that he just said, no, that is not how to read it. It's just talking about humans. And from that point on, he carried a lot of weight in the church for centuries, and that just stuck all the way through the Reformation period. And so I think in recent years, this is starting to come back because we're getting more and more evidence that this is the original viewpoint. But for Jerome is that when he got to chapter 10 with the princes that we're discussing, is that he does say that they were angels stationed over the nations at Babel, and adds the following comment on them, that these are the princes of whom Paul also says, we speak forth among the perfect a wisdom which none of the princes of this world knew. For if they had known it, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. Jerome here is quoting 1 Corinthians 2:8. What Paul and Jerome are saying together here is that the Babel sons of God were behind the scene influencing the Sanhedrin and Pilate to kill Jesus, because they thought if they could kill Jesus, God, is that this would somehow prevent God from judging them and giving them their due punishment. This judgment we read about in Psalm 82, where it described that after they were stationed over the nations, they eventually became corrupt because they got greedy, they took care of the rich and the powerful, and they didn't take care of the poor, they didn't follow God's will on how they were supposed to rule over the nations. And because of their disobedience and rebellion, is that God said that they will die like men. They're going to be punished. And that he is going to take back the nations from them down the road. This reclaiming started with their defeat at the cross, just like Paul said. And then at Pentecost, when we see the outpouring of Spirit and they speak in tongues of all the languages of all the people that they were there witnessing, and that at that point, God is now taking back the nations to himself. Their final judgment, though, will come at the day of the Lord, as we read in Isaiah 24:21. And this gave us a broader perspective of what all that will happen at the Eschaton, because we're going to see, or that we saw here, is that there's actually two camps that are going to get judged by God. We got the spiritual and the physical world that will be judged by him. But we can't forget that there were actually two different groups of sons of God that rebelled in Genesis. We also have the pre-flood sons of God. The pre-flood ones are described in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 as currently being kept in chains under darkness until the day of the Lord. Prior to when I took over for Matt, is that when he went in through chapter 9 of Revelation, is that he showed that they are actually going to be released and be allowed to torture non-believers who don't have the seal of God on their forehead. And so for a period that John says is going to be 5 months, is that they are going to get punished and tortured by these released sons of God, and that those people are going to beg for death, but death will not find them. Kind of a weird situation, but it's one that is found in chapter 9. So our chart actually needs to include these guys into the equation as well. There's a lot of groups, but why put it all in chart form is to hopefully kind of make that mental picture a little clearer for everybody. It's all pretty thick stuff, but with the quotations down below and so forth, is that you can see this is all Old Testament rooted. It's not something that a Christian or in this case John in Revelation just brewed out of his head. It's that this is found in the Old Testament in numerous places. Now with this review is that with going into our Daniel 11 study today and its connections into 11 is that these things are just going to see synced up once again. So let's pick back up with Gabriel's revelation in Daniel, starting in 10:20 all the way to verse 11:4. Then Gabriel said, "Do you know why I have come unto you? But now I will return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. But I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that support me in these things, but Michael your prince. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, Gabriel, stood to confirm him and strengthen him. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 more kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength through his riches he shall stir up against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven. And not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and given to others." What's interesting about verses 10:20 through 11:2a is that they form a chiastic structure of A, B, A, B, A. So it goes back and forth. As you can see here, the A parts all deal with Gabriel talking about his purpose in coming to Daniel. And then while the B parts all are related to the conflicts that Daniel was experiencing and dealing with. What some commentators will say is that Daniel, the author of the book, is binding the 2 chapters, chapters 10 and 11, together to show that the spiritual conflict in chapter 10 is tied with the earthly conflict that is listed out in chapter 11. And so his interweaving of them back and forth is how it's a literary style to kind of bind them together. Daniel's purpose in doing this is to remind his readers that, hey, we're not at war just with flesh and blood. So in some ways you can think that this is his Ephesians 6:12 that we cite often about we're not just at war with flesh and blood. What's interesting with this perspective is that Gabriel's statement in verse 1 said that he supported Darius the Mede in his first year of rule. When you go back to 10:1, it says that Gabriel was met with Daniel in the 3rd year of Cyrus. Now, all these little chronology statements kind of help us to plot things out. And what that does, though, is that chapters 10 through 12, the final vision, is in roughly 536 BC, if you can't see it. And you can see Daniel 6 is back on the first year of Darius. And so with that, is that what happened in Daniel 6? What story? Anybody remember? The lion's den. Yeah. And so Gabriel said that, hey, I was back there helping out with Darius the Mede. Now, where I can personally see Gabriel getting involved is when Darius fasted all night long because, remember, he put together the edict because he was kind of coerced by his guys, like, hey, don't let anybody pray, to a different god for a period of 30 days, and they wanted basically Daniel out of the picture, which forced Darius to throw Daniel into the lion's den because he couldn't go back on his word. But somewhere in that process is that Gabriel was there supporting him. Whether he knew it or not, the text doesn't say. but it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about of, the angelic side trying to help us out, as we go through troubles. Conversely, is that I think it's also possible with that is that maybe these guys were behind the scenes trying to get Daniel's enemies to get Daniel killed too, which kind of mirrors kind of like what happened with Christ's trial, as we read in Paul. The sidebar here is that in Daniel 6 is that I bet many of you have never caught in verse 22 that Daniel actually credited the angel of the Lord from saving him from the lions. And from many discussions that we've had on the angel of the Lord, that figure is who? It's Jesus. It's kind of a different way to think about it, because usually when we see Daniel in the lion's den story, whether it's in a book or in a media movie or something like that, we always kind of see him in there by himself, right? And that the lions are just staying away. But he's giving credit that the angel of the Lord actually protected him throughout that whole night. And this actually mirrors chapter 3's fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Everyone there has always kind of recognized that there's that fourth figure in the fire that stopped them from being burnt alive. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Why do I see 4 when I threw in 3?" And there, we see this figure is called the Son of God, or in some translations they'll say the Son of Gods, because it's Nebuchadnezzar, he's pagan. But also 3:28 said that, again, God sent his angel. And so I kind of find all this stuff pretty neat, because you end up seeing how much Jesus is actually in the book of Daniel over and over again. In chapters 2 through 7, we know that he's the uncut stone, the Son of God, the angel of the Lord, and the Son of Man figure. And in chapters 8 and 10 through 12, we see him standing on the 2 rivers. And from our recent discussions on the Godhead is that we know that he is God. He is the sovereign Lord ruling in the midst of his angelic host. And what this all does is that, we see him in every single chapter, and kind of with that mindset is, what's the most controversial chapter in all of Daniel? Chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. And I would say then if he's showing up in all the rest of them is that he's in chapter 9 as well. And why I say that is because when you look at the 6 points of the 70 weeks prophecy, what's going to be accomplished by it is that only a divine Savior could have these things be checked off. No human could do this. And that my point here is that he is mentioned by Gabriel as the Meshach Nagid. It's sometimes called the Anointed Prince in a lot of translations. And that also in there that he was prophesied to be executed. Now, why show all this is because, if on the critical side, the non-believing person, or whether a Jew or a Gentile, is that when they see this, is that they just cannot buy into the idea that the prophecy of the Messiah would be executed happened years and years and years in advance. They reject the messianic interpretation, but when you get into that possible debate, is that say, hey, look, we see this divine figure everywhere else in the book. Why would he not be in chapter 9? That would be a question. They want to deny the Messiah in there, but this is just another angle to take with them. And all of it ultimately points to what? This divine figure always ruling in the everlasting kingdom. And so just another angle to take with non-believers. That's kind of my apologetic side of things, is kind of how do we show them Christ? And this is just another angle for that. Now back to Gabriel's revelation is that in 11:2, he said that 3 more Persian kings will rule from after Cyrus, and that the 4th one will be the richest one ever and is going to instigate wars with Greece. This precisely fits the historical record with Xerxes the Great being the 4th Persian king from Cyrus. He was also the richest one ever, and was the one who went to war over and over again with Greece. This is just typical history that you would read in your books, Greco-Persian Wars. And after this is that Gabriel says in verse 3 that a mighty Greek king will stand up and rule with great dominion, who everyone, from critic to believer, recognizes is talking about Alexander the Great. Verse 3 aligns itself with chapter 8's vision of the he-goat and its notable horn being Alexander as its first king. Then in verse 4, it says that Alexander's kingdom will be divided towards the four winds of heaven, just like we saw in 8:8. This, we know, is talking about the four sub-kingdoms of the Greek Empire, the Macedonian, Pergamum, Seleucid, and the Ptolemaic. Then in verse 4, it finished saying that the four sub-kingdoms will not descend from Alexander's line. History again confirms this, that because after Alexander died, he did not have a proper heir to the throne. There was no succession plan. One theory or one story says that right before his deathbed, he said, well, give it to the strong, and then he died. And so it's kind of like created this civil war instantly of who's going to claim the throne between them all. But, of all places where they did this partitioning was in Babylon, which is, I don't find coincidental with all our Babylon discussion here in recent weeks. The division ended up creating a power vacuum between all these kingdoms, and it launched the Diadochi Wars that went on for decades. In the regards to the four Gentile empire debate is that these descriptions clearly show the harmony between chapter 2, 7, 8, and 11, that the third empire is Greece. I think everybody in here has kind of bought into that pretty thick. But again, when you go onto YouTube and I get responses is that it's like, yeah, we want to stick with this other one. Some people have had a problem with me when I brought up the whole is America in the Bible. But when you see all these connections, it's kind of hard to keep arguing against Greece as the third and we know Rome as the fourth. Chart-wise is that we can see how verses 1 through 4 horizontally connect in. And then in a prior study is that we have shown how chapter 12 connects in with Daniel 7 at the end with the final time, times, and half a time. And so is that what we get out of chapter 11, at the beginning of 11 and end of 12, if you guys can see over there in the corner, is that we have the bookends here. And the point there is that now seeing this is that we should get a little bit more information about the little horn, i.e. the Antichrist, in chapter 11. Now, we know that at the beginning of chapter 12, it opens up at that time there will be a time of trouble. That connects in very well with Daniel 7's little horn, that he is going to be persecuting and conquering nations around him. Now, for the sake of time, though, is that chapter 11, I don't anticipate anybody reading that. I just want to show you is that it's a long chapter. It's dense. It's filled with a ton of history. It's about 200 years of Greek history in there. I'm not going to cover all those details. And so the 30,000-foot view of this is that verses 5 through 20 kind of go over the Greek Diadochi Wars, basically focusing in on two of those kingdoms' battles. The two are referred to as the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And we know who's who in this because the latter one is described as Egypt in verse 8. And the Seleucids are called the north, and then Egypt or the Ptolemaic is the south. Why they're referred to as that versus saying the Seleucids are the east and Egypt is south is because it's talking about its relationship with Jerusalem. Israel is right in the middle of them. So in their perspective, you got the Seleucids to the north and Egypt to the south, and they would meet always in your territory and duke it out. It's a lot easier to go to a neutral turf to have a battle versus doing it at your hometown. So they kept fighting over that area. A couple of observations with the chart here is that you can ultimately see that Daniel is gearing the reader up to get to Antiochus Epiphanes and his rise to power. We've talked about him quite a bit, and that he is actually a foreshadowing of the eschatological tyrant, as verse 21 calls him a vile person. Were all the prior people good kings? No. But this is just Daniel saying, hey, look, this guy here, we got to focus in on him for a little bit. Everyone agrees that he is discussed all the way to verse 35. So we're moving quickly here through 11. But once you get to verse 36 of Daniel, chapter 11 that is that the debate starts to happen here on whether or not this is all still about Antiochus. Is it about a future tyrant, or is it actually both? Why it could be both is because when you go back to 7 and 8, little horn, is that you can see a lot of similarities between these two. The characteristics mirror one another. But in one of my videos is that I show that there is a clear distinction between these two. That again gets into the whole authorship side and so forth. They're not identical, and they should not be linked together. The other thing is that the chart tells us is that the Jews' problem after Antiochus didn't go away. The rulers kept following him. They didn't get into the everlasting kingdom, and that about 140 BC is when the Hasmonean period, where the Jews kind of had a semi-independence away from the Seleucids for a little bit until we get to Herod the Great. But you can see here is that this is 23 years after Antiochus died. And again, Daniel kept saying, hey, when this evil person goes away, we're supposed to get the kingdom. The kingdom did not happen, obviously, and that's why it's going beyond it. And now, when we get to verse 40, though, is that there's a clear transition that happens here to another tyrant going beyond Antiochus. All commentators, critics, liberals, and conservatives will say that none of these events that are described here apply to Antiochus. And the difference between the critic and the conservative is that critics will say, hey, this just proves how Daniel was an error, the book is not really inspired, and late authorship, it's a forgery. The conservative side, which we would be like, no, he's pointing to a future ruler here. And that is that in verse 40 he says the following about this future ruler. And at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him. The time of the end here is clearly linked to Daniel 12, the time of trouble, the great persecution that's coming. And then in verse 40 continues saying, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. When you look at this, is that I believe that this is the reference to these two kings going at it, is that with the evil ruler that's to come, is that we see him going out and conquering multiple countries, and that this is tied back to Daniel's discussion about how this 11th king is going to subdue 3 kings, 3 of the 10, in his rise to power. And then in 725, we know that he's going to persecute the saints, which is equivalent to chapter 12's time of trouble. Verse 41. He then shall enter all into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, in this, he says that 3 countries are going to get a pass. Why? No reason. They just get to. But it's actually one of those clear reasons why we know it's not talking about Antiochus, because in the book of Maccabees, that talks about the Maccabean revolt, is that Judas Maccabeus ends up attacking Edom because Edom attacked them after they cleansed the temple. And so why I keep going over all this kind of history is because if you know the history really well, is that you'll win the debate when talking with critics and liberals about this. Now, whether or not they change their mind and recognize that the book is inspired and the Messiah is in there, that's a whole other thing. But history is on our side in this. Now, verses 42 and 43. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps, or he would be their followers. Now, are these the three countries that the Antichrist will subdue? Possibly. But what's interesting here is the reference to him having power over the treasures of gold and silver. Because if you think in Revelation, what is said there about the Antichrist? That he will control that nobody will be able to buy or sell anything. It's kind of crazy stuff to think about, but, hey, here it is. And our final two verses for today. But reports out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And therefore to go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to annihilate many. That's another way to read it. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. What we see here is the Antichrist's final assault on God's people, and that his headquarters is going to be in Jerusalem. This final battle that is associated with mountain language here in verse 45 should make you kind of think of what in Revelation? The Battle of Armageddon. In Hebrew, it's actually Har, Mageddon, and Har is the Hebrew word for mountain. And what's interesting about the sixth bowl judgment here in Revelation 16 is that it actually ties in perfectly with our whole Babel discussion about the sons of God in there. Because in verses 12 through 14, it says the following. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. This is likely the report that, kind of gets this future ruler enraged, because he's probably hearing about God is, pouring out his wrath right now in the bowl judgments, and he knows he's going to lose really quick. So he's pulling everybody together for one final assault, and maybe we somehow get lucky and win this thing, which we know is not going to happen. And that his defeat is going to come very soon after this point. And we also see in Revelation 16:13 is that there's actually a third person here called the false prophet, something that we'll get into a little bit when we get back into Revelation in a couple weeks. And verse 14 here backed up our Babel discussion that we're having, because it was talking about the evil spiritual beings behind the scenes giving these guys power and authority. We know Satan has his own authority, obviously, over them all. But we see there in the works as well. This basically confirms our whole discussion and inclusion about all these characters that are in there, and that at the Christ's return is that he's going to judge them all, and that, as we sang about in Revelation 21, is that at that point all sin is going to be wiped away, no more death, no more sorrow, and these guys' persecution on the world will be completely over at that point. Now, I know it's a truckload of stuff. It's just getting fire hosed with a lot. I get all that. And that's why I do put it into chart form, as many pictures and visual demonstrations that I can to hopefully, that helps me remember it a little bit better. Hopefully, being a teacher, I know most kids are visual learners, not auditory learners. So I know with kind of this heavy, thick stuff is that this is probably the best way to soak it in. And so I hope that has helped you kind of tracking out all this. And next week is that we'll finish up Daniel 12 and see some connections in there. There's some events that are described that we don't see described in Revelation, but are clearly tied to one another, especially one key event that kind of triggers this whole thing. And so we have a couple weeks here left where I think I'm filling in for Matt, as long as little to be determined, we don't have a name yet, doesn't come anything sooner than June 30th, but anything over that week, I think I'm kind of pressing my luck. So let's close out in prayer. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. And in the meantime, stay salty.